Thanks everyone for joining us today, and welcome to our Intro to Social Enterprise on the topic of what legal structures should we choose. This topic is part of our but a mainstay part of our work at Integral.org, and that is helping any nonprofit navigate those complex legal aspects of running an organization. If you're not already familiar, my name is Liz Tang. I use the pronoun she, her, and I'm the education coordinator for Integral.org. I'll be around hosting and monitoring the chat and any sort of tech support I might be able to help with. And so without further ado, we'll get on with it. So we always like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional ancestral territory of many peoples, presently subjects to Treaties 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. And here at Integral.org, we're very grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and the elders who are still with us today, as well as those who have gone before us. Yeah, we're very excited to bring 2 very knowledgeable lawyers on the subject today. First, we have Yvonne Chenier. She's a lawyer and philanthropy consultant and co-founder of Integral.org. And she brings more than 35 years of experience helping those in the philanthropic, nonprofit, and social enterprise sectors as a general legal counsel and an advisor on planning, organizational, regulatory, and governance matters. She's an active member of the executives of the Charities and Nonprofit section of the Canadian Bar Association and is past chair of both the Alberta and the national sections. And she's named in the Canadian Legal Expert Directory for Excellence in Charity Law and has been selected by her peers for inclusion in the Best Lawyers in Canada for her work in charities and nonprofit law. So thank you, Yvonne, for joining us today. And we're also joined by Kristina Roberts. She is passionate about helping build impactful and sustainable social purpose organizations, and she works to understand the needs of her clients from a holistic perspective. Kristina strives to provide valuable legal advice and is practical and accessible, and she is also a member of the social impact group at Miller Thomson. She often provides general advice to charities, nonprofits, and social enterprise, and she has a particular interest in developing innovative structures for social enterprise. So yeah, without further ado, we'll hop into the overview. I believe that's Yvonne.
Thanks, Liz, and welcome everyone. It's nice to talk to you again on one of my favorite topics. So the purpose of our webinar today is to give you a basic overview on nonprofit structures and statutes that are common for you who want to operate your social enterprise structure in Alberta. We're going to be talking a little bit about the Societies Act, the Companies Act, the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, and we'll highlight some of the most important Canada Revenue Agency and Income Tax Act business rules for charities. Social enterprises and the Income Tax Act, well, you'll hear a little bit about that as well. The next slide, we have a definition of social enterprise for us to work today. And this is one that we've used for many years. The government has used it. There's really no official definition of what a social enterprise is. It's almost what anyone thinks it is, but this is a good one. It says it's an innovative business model, whether not-for-profit or for-profit, that pursues a social, cultural, or environmental mission through the sale of goods and services, with the majority of net profits directed back to its mission. So as you see in this definition and in most definitions that I've reviewed, it does refer to the fact that social enterprises could be operated through a for-profit structure as well. But today, for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on nonprofit structures. So the next slide talks about the nonprofit legislation that you could select to create your organization in Alberta. Now, this is what you could select to create any nonprofit organization in Alberta. It doesn't have to be a social enterprise kind of operation, but these are the ones that if you plan to do what you consider to be a social enterprise and you want to create a nonprofit structure, these are the three most common that you would consider. So the first one that's probably most familiar to all of you, is the Societies Act. So that seems to be the go-to for many people when they're starting a nonprofit organization in Alberta. And if they don't really think through the process of what commercial activities might happen inside the society once incorporated, they may still go through and incorporate the society. There are many societies incorporated in Alberta, but the legislation does say that societies may be incorporated for any benevolent, philanthropic, charitable, provident, scientific, artistic, literary, social, educational, agriculture, sporting, or other useful purpose. But it does say that it cannot be incorporated for the purpose of carrying on a trade or business. And certainly, as is common with most nonprofit entities, you cannot declare any dividends or distribute property among your members. So there's the society. Social enterprise, could be benevolent, philanthropic, a useful purpose, but you have to be cautious of the fact that the Act specifically says you cannot operate any or carry on any trade or business. So that's something to consider. So that's often why we go to the next statute in Alberta that creates nonprofit organizations. And these are nonprofits incorporated under Part 9 of the Alberta Companies Act. And these can be incorporated for the purposes of promoting art, science, religion, charity, or any other useful object. And it doesn't state anything about any prohibition about carrying on any trade or business. And indeed, this statute is one of the oldest statutes in Alberta for structures to carry on nonprofit organizations. The Companies Act used to allow businesses to be carried on under that, for-profit businesses, but in 1982, those business corporations moved into the more modern Alberta Business Corporations Act, and the nonprofit companies were left in the Companies Act, Part 9 of the Companies Act, although the whole Companies Act, as it is now left, does apply to companies incorporated under Part 9 of the Companies Act. We hope to get a modern statute soon, but up until then, we are left with using the Companies Act for the kinds of nonprofits that wouldn't be societies, for example, because the intention is similar to societies in that the profits are not to be given to the members, but they are to promote the objects of the company. So the most modern one, though, legislation in Canada, is the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, and that's a federal statute. And nothing in that act prohibits engaging in commercial activities as well. But like other nonprofit statutes, does specify that no part of the corporation's property or profits may be distributed to members, directors, or officers of the corporation except in furtherance of its activities or otherwise permitted by the Act. This is a very flexible statute to create social enterprise structures. And one extra step one has to go through if you are going to select a Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act structure is, remember, it is a federal statute. To be recognized as a registered entity in Alberta, you have to register it in Alberta. That's the next step after incorporating in Canada. You register it in Alberta to carry on your activities. So that's just adds a little bit of extra step for you and a little bit of extra annual maintenance and slight more disbursements. But other than that, it is the most modern statute. And the one that we go to if people are willing to embrace a more modern structure for their social enterprise rather than, I'll call it the archaic Companies Act that we have in Alberta. Thank you for that. So the next slide is a poll. And this is the fun part because we want to know what legislation your organization is incorporated under. We want to get some idea of the kinds of organizations that we're talking to in this webinar today.
And I just want to remind people that the poll is completely anonymous, so we're not really collecting any data out of this. We're just kind of curious how today's information applies. Right, so we got 13 out of 16. I'll share the results. So we do have about 64% of folks incorporated under the Societies Act, and then a 21% not a registered nonprofit, and the remaining under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act.
Okay, great. Thank you. And that sort of reflects what we see at corporate registry when we look at the numbers of entities and how they're incorporated in Alberta. Most nonprofits are societies. Well, there's a few companies too, but not in this audience. And a few of you have already seen the benefits of the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act and found a way to have it in your structure. And those of you that are not a registered nonprofit are probably thinking about it, or your individuals interested in the topic, and we welcome everyone for sure. So we probably don't need to talk much about the Companies Act, and that's probably a good thing. But we'll turn it over to Kristina because she's going to give you some insight into our next topic.
Thanks, Yvonne. Happy to be here. So many nonprofits also have registered charity status under the Income Tax Act. So if your organization is a charity, this has implications on if and how you can run a social enterprise. And so the first thing to figure out if you're a registered charity is which designation your charity has been given by CRA. There's 3 designations. There's private foundations, public foundations, and charitable organizations. And all of registered charities are considered to be what's called qualified donees under the Income Tax Act. There's a few other types of organizations that are also qualified donees. That includes registered journalism organizations, registered Canadian amateur athletic associations, and most government-related entities. But today we're only going to talk about registered charities. So let's dive into what each of these designations means. So for private foundations, that designation is given if 50% or more of the charity's directors, trustees, or officers do not deal with each other at arm's length. So that means that they are related in some way, whether that's through blood or marriage, or they control the same corporation. They are just related in some aspect. And another reason why the private foundation designation might be given is if 50% or more of the charity's funds are coming from a person or a group that does not deal at arm's length with the charity. So this designation usually applies to family foundations and many charities that are funded or controlled by companies. So next slide, public foundations. So a public foundation designation is given to charities that have 50% or more of their directors, officers, or trustees that are not arm's length with each other, or sorry, that are arm's length with each other. So they're not related. And most of the funding is coming from people who are not related to the charity. And another important thing to keep in mind with public foundations is that they're required to give away more than half of their income by making grants to other qualified donees, so other registered charities, generally speaking. And this is the designation we typically see for public-facing foundations like community foundations. So next slide, please, is charitable organizations. So this is the third designation. So these are very similar to the public foundations in that the directors and the funding sources are arm's length from the charity. But the difference between a charitable organization and a public foundation is that charitable organizations are the charities that are actually carrying out activities themselves for the most part. So they're rolling up their sleeves, they are out there carrying out the activities. And so this is the designation that's given to most charities that's probably top of mind for people, like social service agencies, food banks, churches, and all kinds of charities like that. So what does this have to do with social enterprise? So we know about the 3 different types of charities, and it's important to know your designation of your charity, because for private foundations, they are prohibited from running any type of business. So starting a social enterprise inside a charity that's designated as a private foundation that might be a non-starter. That said, there are certain activities that we may think of as social enterprise or as commercial activities that CRA might not actually consider to be a business. And we'll get into that a little bit more. If you're a public foundation or a charitable organization, you can operate a business, but the business needs to be what's called a related business under the Income Tax Act. And we will talk about what that means as well. So now I'll pass it back over to Yvonne.
We have another poll because we want to know not only where you're incorporated, we need to know if you know what your designation is under the Income Tax Act.
All right, we're getting some results coming in. I mean, obviously, here I'll end the poll and share the results. Obviously, we had a good proportion of folks that weren't a registered charity, but we do have 43% that are designated as a charitable organization, and then 7% as a private foundation and 7% as I don't know.
Well, that's interesting. So if you don't know what your designation is, go and look your charity up on the CRA Charities Directorate website, and the designation will appear there. So you'll not only see if you're a private foundation, a public foundation, or a charitable organization, you'll see under what category they put you in as well. Lots of information to see. And those of you who are not a registered charity, well, that's fine, because we will talk about the Income Tax Act provisions for just plain old nonprofit organizations as well. That's coming up as well. Those who are private foundations, thanks for attending, and certainly, you know, you're learning a lot about social enterprise, and hopefully able to fund some organizations that will be carrying on social enterprises if you cannot do them yourself. And those of you who are charitable organizations are probably looking for other revenue sources and are looking to social enterprise as a potential to add to your bottom line. And we don't have any public foundations. Well, they can fund you all too. So there you go. So there's lots of hope. So the next couple of slides will be talking about Canada Revenue Agency in general, what their general policies are of things that we're talking about social enterprise, although I think you'll be able to know that much of the Income Tax Act doesn't even mention the word. So what we're talking about here is probably something you wouldn't find in the Act, but it applies, because social enterprise, as far as CRA is concerned, and probably in general common sense, involves some kind of a commercial activity, because you're generating some kind of a revenue for some purpose, for a social purpose. So it does involve a commercial activity, and it goes on to define that you have to derive your revenue from providing goods or services, so you're selling something, and you are doing this activity because you want to make a profit. So that's basically a definition of commercial activity. So think about what you're doing. Are you doing something that's you're getting revenue from, and are you intending to make a profit? So CRA considers, if they're trying to figure out if an entity is carrying on a business activity, they're looking at the intended course of action. What do you intend with the activity that you're doing? Do you intend to earn a profit? Have you ever earned a profit in this activity, and you see it as a good thing, so you're going to continue to do it? And the expertise, who's running the organization or the revenue generating activity? Are the experts at it? Have they been hired specifically to get the revenue for you in this respect? So these are some of the things that CRA will look at, or anyone would look at if you're going to say, someone's going to ask you, are we actually doing a commercial activity? So there are some exceptions for charities, and I'm just trying to get to my screen where I can X out the poll. I still see the poll in my screen. Liz, is it gone from yours?
It should be gone from from everyone's windows if you just exit out of that.
Exit.
Yeah.
So registered charities, as Kristina was saying, have a special place in the Income Tax Act to carry on business activities, commercial activities, if the activities are related to their charitable purposes. And that is the big exception and sometimes the saving grace for registered charities that want to carry on the social enterprise inside their registered charity corporate structure, whether it be a society, which it seems that many of you are, or a Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. So the related business exception is there, but there are some other specific exceptions that we alert people here too, because you say, well, we're doing this, this, and this, and is that a business? Like soliciting donations, we're asking people for money. No, CRA does not initially consider that a business activity unless that's all you're doing. If you're a fundraising entity, then you're definitely, running a business activity or commercial activities. If you're doing short-term fundraising, that's expected. If you're selling donated goods, that's definitely an exception in the Income Tax Act for charities. So people donate goods to you and then you sell them. That's an accepted exception for a registered charity. Commercial economic development businesses, there's a whole guidance that CRA has on that, and that guidance is a good one for organizations to go to if their business activity or commercial activity is somehow improving the community that they're living in. There's various descriptions in that the guidance that CRA has that might be helpful for some of the activities that you would be doing that you wouldn't have to worry about being a related business because they're accepted to you as a registered charity under the Income Tax Act. Investment activities, again, that's not carrying on a business. If you're, putting your surplus in a GIC or something like that, that's not a business activity as long as it's not taking over your whole charity. And fees charged for charitable programs. So if you are a charity that's delivering services to the public, if you are charging fees to deliver those services, then that is an exception for charities to the business activity rule. So those are some good things for charities. The next slide talks about the related business rules in general by using an example. So the Women in Need Society is a society in Calgary, and what they do is they have a whole store where they're taking in donated goods and they're selling those donated goods. So as you saw, under the exceptions under the Income Tax Act, they would not be considered to be offside because that activity directly relates to their charitable purpose. The related business rules break down a little more. There's two kinds of related businesses. Businesses that are run substantially by volunteers. So think about the hospital gift shops that are run by the volunteers that sell goods inside the hospital. And there are other businesses that are run by volunteers for other kinds of charities as well, if you really think about it, and CRA has many examples in their guidance. And the most important one is the businesses that are linked to the charity's purpose and subordinate to that purpose. And us charity lawyers, and Kristina and I have been around the block on this one. What does it mean, subordinate and then linked? We talk about this all the time. And we try to boil it down to, you can do your business activity to further your purposes, the charitable purposes that are stated in your objects clause in your corporate documents that CRA has approved, as long as it's linked to those purposes and it's not the whole thing your organization is doing. So a charity that does nothing but a business activity, might be offside because it's not subordinate to your actual purpose. CRA used to have a decision tree, and you'll find some copies of that decision tree still around where you answered questions, if yes, then no, if yes, then no. Then you go on to the next step to decide if you are doing something that's linked and subordinate. And our toolkit that Kristina will talk about has another good pathway for you to do that. So as Kristina pointed out, who can operate these related businesses? Well, only charitable organizations and public foundations. So we have some charitable organizations here. We don't have any public foundations. So all you charitable organizations can operate your business activities, your commercial activities, as long as they're either totally run by volunteers or if they're linked to the charitable purposes that have been approved by CRA for your organization, and they're subordinate to that purpose, not taking over the whole organization. So that's the most simplistic way we can explain what the related business rules are, although they go on for pages and pages in the guidance. So that's the simple way. The next slide is our toolkit. So I'm just going to introduce it, and I know we have a little clip for you, but Kristina Roberts, when she was with INTEGRAL, she was the person in charge of creating this project, and we're very proud of it, and we still maintain it on our website, and we like to show you a little clip that was done when we first rolled out this toolkit a couple of years ago that shows how you can walk your way through our toolkit and create as many social enterprises as you possibly can in your mind before you actually have to execute on your plans. So it's an excellent tool. I advise you to get into it and have a good look. And here's a little demonstration of it.
Welcome to the demo of Integral Org's Social Enterprise Legal Structures Toolkit. I'll click Learn More to open up the toolkit, and here we are on the landing page. Before you start an assessment, you should have a business plan for the social enterprise you plan to embark on. For an established organization, you should have an understanding of which legislation your organization was incorporated under and whether you have charitable status. Since some users might not know this information, we included some guidance on how to find out here below, as well as some additional resources on the toolkit landing page. I'd like to walk you through an example of how an existing organization can use the toolkit to find legal and regulatory information that relates directly to a social enterprise activity that they are planning to integrate into their operations. We're going to use an example of a nonprofit organization incorporated under the Alberta Companies Act that does not have charitable status. This organization is a community association, and they are interested in operating a cafe within their facility to make it a more enjoyable place for community members and to support the cost of operations. So when you're ready to start an assessment, click this button, and we will get started. So our community association is located in Alberta, so I click yes to this question. The next question asks whether we have an existing legal structure or organization, and there's an information icon that we can click on that links to a tooltip explaining what we mean by organization in this context. And in this context, we know we do have an existing organization, so I'm clicking yes, and we would prefer to operate the cafe inside our existing structure. So I'm clicking yes to this question as well. Users should have a thorough understanding of their organization's stated objects or purposes in their incorporating documents and their mission, vision, values, and strategic priorities. So I will click yes to this question because we have all of these things for our community association. This question asks whether our organization is incorporated. And again, there's a definition of what we mean by incorporation, which helps us answer the question. So we know that our community association is in fact incorporated, and it's incorporated under the Companies Act. So we'll select that from the options here. We also know that our community association is not a registered charity. So we're answering no to this question. The next two questions are trying to get at whether we might need charitable status to get the startup capital necessary to start our social enterprise. We have a tooltip here explaining what charitable tax receipt means. And it's an acknowledgement that a donor will be entitled to a reduction in their income tax payment because of a gift given to a registered charity. In this case, we will say that the source of startup capital for the cafe is not demanding a tax receipt. So we're going to answer no to this question. The startup capital is also not coming from a source that only funds registered charities. In this case, the startup capital might be coming from a municipality or other government source, or the community association might have simply hosted a series of fundraising events to get enough money to start its cafe. So we're answering no to this question. And this next question is key. Do you anticipate that your social enterprise activity will consistently generate a significant surplus for the organization? there is a tooltip here that provides us with more information about what we mean by significant surplus. And this refers to excess income that accumulates an amount greater than the organization's reasonable needs to carry out its social purpose activities. In this case, the income brought in by the cafe is going to be part of the community association's overall operating budget, which will be balanced by the expenses it incurs to carry out its community purposes. So the cafe will not be operated for the purposes of generating a profit. So we can answer no. And nonprofits need to be careful here, because if the cafe were being started to generate excess income, it might jeopardize the nonprofit status under the Income Tax Act. And that's true regardless of what profits are used for. So we answer no, and that brings us to a result that discusses carrying on a business activity inside an established organization. So this is what a typical result looks like. It'll have an overview of the result and then several other drop-down items and accordions that provide further information. This result explains that there's nothing in the Companies Act that prohibits these entities from carrying on business activities. It goes on to discuss tax implications and explains that tax-exempt nonprofit organizations are generally permitted to carry on business activities that compete with taxable entities, as long as they're not operating with a profit purpose, either intentionally or unintentionally. So the conclusion is that we can start the social enterprise within our existing structure, so long as the business is directly connected to the nonprofit goals and activities, and any surplus earned is unanticipated. The result also contains some cautions about different risks, tolerances that the organization needs to be able to take on, and also some information about GST and some other regulatory considerations. So this brings us to the end of our example. You can complete an assessment as many times as you'd like, and your different versions will show up here. You can review your answers as well as your previous results. And you will be able to also share these by downloading a PDF or copying a shareable link. There are also case studies of successful social enterprises that are featured throughout the toolkit, though none happened to come up during our particular assessment. But if you wanted to see those, you can go down to resources and click the bottom link here, which will take you to a page that has a list of all the definitions used in the toolkit, as well as all the results and the case studies. And I will just open up an example of what a case study looks like, so you can get a sense of what those look like. And we encourage you to explore all of the different definitions and case studies for a rich learning experience. We hope that you find the toolkit helpful, and we welcome any feedback or questions you might have.
Great. That was a really good video then, and it still is now, and we're very proud of it. And thanks to Kristina for being the project lead on that, our funders for funding it, the legal committee, volunteers, and the lawyers across the country who are our charity and nonprofit law colleagues who reviewed the contents of this and continue to review it to make sure that it's relevant today. So I talked about the charity taxation stuff and the exemptions and the related business rules. You saw in the demo to the toolkit that there's another side to the story. If you're not a registered charity, it's not so easy. So I'll turn it over to Kristina to talk about operating a social enterprise inside a nonprofit that's not a registered charity.
Thanks, Yvonne. It was fun to have a look at the toolkit again. It's very cool, and it was such a fun project to be a part of. It's very thorough, so if you're wondering about legal structures, definitely take a look at that. So yeah, as Yvonne mentioned, the demo video did get into a few of the considerations for nonprofits that aren't registered charities. And Yvonne did mention earlier in the presentation about what the corporate legislation says about business activities for nonprofits. So now we're going to look at what it means from a tax perspective. So next slide. So the tax status of nonprofits is governed by section 149(1)(l) under the Income Tax Act. And it says that nonprofits can be exempted from income tax as long as they are organized and operated for any purpose except profit. And they also can't make their income available for the personal benefit of members or shareholders. So this is a broader definition than just saying, your purposes you can't be incorporated for a profit purpose, because it goes on to consider the operations of the nonprofit. And there isn't a ton of guidance around how this section is interpreted, but in the CRA guidance and case law that we do have, CRA has taken a very restrictive approach to this provision, basically taking the position that nonprofits can't do anything with the intention of earning a profit. So that obviously has implications for social enterprise. So next slide. So this leads to the question of whether nonprofits can carry out commercial activities at all. And there is CRA guidance on this. It's very old and it's been archived, but it's one of the only things we have to point to. And thankfully, it does state that generally the carrying on of a business will not be offside section 149(1)(l) if that business is directly connected with the nonprofit goals and activities. So again, you're looking at your objects or purposes in your corporate documents, and you're trying to connect your business in some way to that. And so that does open the door for social enterprise for nonprofits that are tax exempt. So next slide. So it's clear that a nonprofit can't have an explicit purpose to make a profit stated in their corporate documents. But how do you know if you're operating for a profit purpose or an unstated profit purpose, as CRA says? So sometimes CRA will look at an organization and they will consider a variety of factors to determine if that organization is operating for a profit purpose. So that includes whether it's it's generating surplus and operating on a profit basis rather than a cost recovery basis every year, whether excess income is accumulating regularly in an amount that's greater than the organization's needs to cover its programs and activities. And so you're looking at your budget and your financial statements and seeing how, if you're generating a profit every year. And if it's year after year, then that's going to be an issue for CRA. So a lot of the issues with running a business inside a nonprofit do come down to budgeting. And the risk of claiming a tax exemption under 149(1)(l) if you were actually operating for a profit purpose is that CRA could come back and reassess your organization for unpaid taxes for previous years, and it could be subject to penalties. So you want to be careful about this and make sure that if you are carrying out commercial activities, you're budgeting properly, the activities are connected to your nonprofit goals. So next slide. So this is just to summarize sort of what we've talked about in this section of the presentation. And it's generally that nonprofits are allowed to run a social enterprise as long as it's connected in some way with the objects and the income brought in is balanced appropriately with the expenses so that the organization is operating on a cost recovery basis. So in that cafe example in the demo video, it's possible that the cafe itself could be generating, surplus, but that is being used to balance to cover the costs of the nonprofit's programming of the community association, and so the overall budget is balanced. So that is how that would work. Where you need to be careful is if you're trying to flow funds out of the organization. Even if you were directing those to a registered charity or a cause that you think is aligned with your nonprofit's mission, unfortunately, CRA will probably view that as operating for a profit purpose because you do have those surplus funds to flow out, and they think that you shouldn't have that if you're a nonprofit. So that is just something to be aware of. And the next slide. So this is the language that CRA usually points to when they're considering this issue. And it might come across in education letters and the like from CRA. And the important thing here is that last sentence. So it's a question of fact whether any organization is exempt from tax pursuant to paragraph 149(1)(l). So what that means is it really depends on the circumstances of any organization. So we're just kind of providing general guidance here of what nonprofits are allowed to do from a tax perspective, but we can't really know for sure if, we can say, go ahead, run a business without considering all the facts and sort of looking at the circumstances. So now I will pass it back over to Yvonne and
Thank you. I think, what we pointed out is, the latter, the nonprofit scenario, it's a question of fact, whether CRA deems that you're operating your social enterprise and it's a commercial activity inside your nonprofit, that they wouldn't consider a nonprofit kind of activity for a nonprofit organization. But in a registered charity, the rules seem to be clearer, right? They've got the guidance, related business is permitted. As long as it's related to your core purposes or it's run by volunteers. So it's usually easier to advise a registered charity on how to create a social enterprise than a nonprofit as to how they can create a social enterprise. And then things that we didn't even get into in this webinar, there's all sorts of other fancy structures you can create to create a social enterprise that will work. But they're all complicated. They're all take a lot of administration, but we like to have a can-do attitude, don't we? In the sector, that if we need to do something, we'll find a way to get it done to generate some revenue. So those are important things. So if there's any questions, let's have them now. We always get some really good questions in these webinars, and if there are no questions here, then we're always around for questions on these issues in our legal clinics.
Yeah, I'll give folks
Any
a
questions?
few. Oh, yeah, no, so far, no questions in the chat. We'll give folks a few minutes. I know it always takes me a couple minutes to type up a question in the chat. But while folks are putting those in, I will just say, sometimes there are very specific questions that we try to address, but perhaps like the format of the webinar is not necessarily the full format where we can fully go in depth with all the given details about each organization. And so in those cases, sometimes we'll suggest, maybe this is a question for a clinic that we do, and not so much as a way to kind of brush off very specific situations or questions, but more as a way that we can really delve into each individual's circumstances. And so we do free legal clinics, and that Yvonne would be the one that would be helping you out in those free legal clinics. And so what those look like, if you reach out to our admin, it'll just be like a 1-hour problem solving session. So yeah, and then if there are any other, shorter questions that you have, we're always open to answering those, whether it relates to things like strategy, governance, maybe you want some sort of workshops brought to your organization. Yeah, that's just part of our mission to help out other nonprofits. But since we don't have any questions, I did have one. Not sure who is the most keen to answer this one, but do you feel like the landscape of social enterprise has changed because of the pandemic, or, did we see more innovations because operations had to change, or or maybe what sorts of opportunities present itself now in the post-COVID world, now that we have a lot of demands for services? Yeah, any thoughts about that?
Kristina, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we definitely saw a decrease in funding during the pandemic, just because, a lot of the fundraising activities that organizations were used to carrying out, like events and in-person things, they couldn't do that anymore. And I think some of the government funding kind of dried up a little bit. We have some recovery funds now that are in the under works, but I think organizations were looking for ways to generate revenue. So I think social enterprise did look at like an attractive possibility. I haven't seen necessarily like a ton of uptake personally. I think there's been more interest in like impact investing and that sort of thing, I think, arising from the pandemic, but I'm not sure, Yvonne, if you've seen more social enterprise activity?
Well, I think that there's been activity and a lot of questions, and people are looking for other revenue sources. How do we increase our revenue? And, you know, revenue and business seem to go hand in hand. But just as in many other things, Liz, even if there's been an uptake in ideas and everything, the law hasn't changed. I mean, the law is always behind social change anyway, and the Income Tax Act is as it was before the pandemic in this area. And the Companies Act, you know, and Societies Act, and none of the legislation has changed. There is no Social Enterprise Act, so not yet, but the law will catch up one day. People are talking about it, so I'm hopeful.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we do have a couple questions. I'll start off with this one. Would a fancy structure potentially be a profit-generating business and a private foundation that then donates those profits to a nonprofit service organization, and then the business then pays taxes? Yeah, any light shown on that kind of scenario?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the specific details on that one, but many of these structures do involve a business corporation that has as its purpose to generate profit. And sometimes the business corporations are owned by the charities. Then they would benefit, you know, from the dividend stream from the business. But there's structures to create, but there's the intention to benefit, you know, an end goal would be to benefit a charity. And you have to keep the administration of all these structures in mind too, because, you know, charities cannot be administering complicated structures. That's not within their purpose. The administration often has to be outside the registered charity itself. So there's various ways, and just because you see a structure that someone else is doing doesn't mean it'll fit you. You might be incorporated under a different legislation. You may have less administration coverage than they do. So it's always good to apply it to your specific situation.
Great. Yep. Kristina, any comments on that, or do you feel like
yeah, I would just say, like, in terms of the private foundation, that is often a way that they get around that, you know, prohibition on business activities is by sort of creating a separate for-profit corporation. So that can be done, and also can be done in the circumstances even if you're a charitable organization or public foundation, and you find that your business isn't related to your purpose, or maybe it's, you know, it's becoming super profitable, it's kind of taking over your operations, then you might spin it out into a separate taxable entity. So yeah, definitely lots of possibilities.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's also a trust structure too, a common trust structure that is used depending on the scenario. So lots of good ways to do it. There's always a way.
Yeah, I find this topic, it always brings up such creative ideas, which is really fun. Our next question, I'm sure, is a common one. We are nonprofit under the Societies Act. If we establish a social enterprise as a nonprofit, will it make it more difficult to seek charitable status at a later date?
Yeah, that's like a two-pronged question, really.
Yeah.
Charitable status is given to charities, right? So to get a charitable status, you have to be a charity, act like a charity, look like a charity. So if your social enterprise is not charitable, then you're not going to become a charity. So it's almost like a we need to know the facts kind of question. It depends. I always say, though, if you think you ever want to apply for charitable status, or you're going to need it in the future, you know, you should really plan for that in how you create your organization. Because you don't become a charity at some point, you are a charity. And because you are a charity, you're given status when you apply. So you have to sort of think in reverse. I don't know if that's helpful. Kristina, do you have another way of explaining that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Yeah, I guess if you went to apply, like if you did have a business activity in your nonprofit and you went to apply, CRA would consider whether that's a related business. So they would look at you as if you were a charity, as Yvonne says. So, you you want to make it a related business, and if it's not, maybe you have it in a separate entity and then you apply for charitable status. So yeah, it really depends.
And those types of like scenario kind of like organizational planning questions are often the ones that I think come up in clinics as well. So feel free to reach out to us and book a clinic with us if you would want to dive into that issue further. So yeah, not any other questions so far. Yvonne or Kristina, do you have any other kind of notes or things to mention?
I see one, I guess it's more of a comment
Yeah.
in the chat there, saying, I get the sense that social enterprise isn't really a way to generate additional revenue for a not-for-profit. So yeah, I mean, that's true. I like, as in you're not going to have surplus. I mean, you're not allowed to generate surplus, but as I mentioned with that cafe example, if it's just one kind of department of your nonprofit that's generating revenue to fund another area of your nonprofit, that might be okay. So just all fact specific.
Yeah, you have to look at that situation very carefully, right? Because the word nonprofit clearly means nonprofit. So, and business activities usually generate a profit. So there's almost like a disconnect there in the whole way it's looked at. And we're hopeful that there'll be legislation and income tax act acknowledgements of this kind of activity, but it's not coming yet. But there's certainly a lot of pressure and a lot of talk about it. Law reform is needed in this area. So people that like you that ask that question have certainty, when you have an idea that you can function inside a corporate structure, that you're not always going to have to wonder about if you're breaching anything. But until then, it's hard. It's hard in a nonprofit for many reasons. It's easier in a charity.
Yeah. We have another comment. If you generate profit and invest it for security or future spending for a nonprofit organization, is that allowed?
That's investing. Investing is a commercial activity, right? And that's, why would you invest your money? Why? Not to lose it. You invest your money to generate a profit. That's a profit that's a profit making thing. So that's one of the easy ones to pick up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's maybe like one case in case law where they said it was permitted for a nonprofit to engage in investment activity, but it was like directly related to their programs somehow. So it was
a Canadian Bar Association, Insurance Association, right? So it was quite the case, but yeah, I wouldn't want to hang my hat on that one though.
No, it's very specific to the circumstances. So most of the time, it's probably not a good idea. But charities can do it.
Charities, yeah, can do it. But if you talk to an accountant about that question, they can talk to you about, reserve things, normal reserves that you should carry, business principles, things on your financial statements, that you could justify having a small reserve for. But just to generate money to invest inside a nonprofit is definitely an indication of a profit making intention, I would think.
So then I guess what I'm taking away is that generally do people enter into a social enterprise to help make other aspects of their organization more sustainable and or finding like creative ways to fulfill their mission is kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think definitely inside a nonprofit or charity, that's probably a good way to frame it. But if it's a separate entity, or if it's for profit, or if it's a co-op, there's all sorts of different ways to run it. That might be for different reasons, and some might have more of a profit motive than others.
Okay.
But we hope you start with some social impact idea inside your your thought process when you're talking about social enterprise. That you're going to do good for someone, and incidentally, it generates revenue. Incidentally,
Mhm.
and it covers the costs. That would help.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions or comments in the chat, so maybe we'll just wrap up and then we'll get everyone out of here on time. So we have our survey here, which I'm going to copy into the chat very smoothly here. There we go. So yes, as I mentioned, I'll be emailing out the recording along with this survey once the recording becomes available. And so we're always very interested in getting a sense of what topics or issues you'd like us to explore, especially as it relates to legal matters. And so we are crafting our next legal offerings using your suggestions, so you can kind of give your input here on this survey. Shouldn't take more than 4 minutes. Maybe it's a topic on how to start certain types of nonprofits or charities. I know we kind of are interested in doing that topic, but yeah, that's the place to have that voice heard. And yeah, I have mentioned these services already. But if you are interested in checking out other things we do, as I said, legal support is just one of the aspects in which we support nonprofits and charities in Alberta, or sometimes slightly beyond. But yeah, feel free to check out our website or sign up for our newsletter. That's the best way to keep in touch with the work that we do. And just like to thank everyone for their time. I know, sometimes it takes a lot of time and attention to attend an online webinar these days, and I do appreciate all the engagement as well. Yeah, I'll leave it to Yvonne and Kristina for any closing thoughts.
No, thank you, everyone. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and look forward to meeting you all at some point. And thanks, Kristina. I appreciate your attendance here too.
Yeah, thanks Yvonne and Liz for hosting. It's been great.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.